Welcome back to Behind the Recipe. I'm Christina, and I'm so excited to have you join me today. If you're a food lover, a home cook, or someone who just loves a good kitchen conversation, you are in the right place. Join me every week as we dive into the joys of cooking, we explore kitchen tips and tricks, and share delicious recipes that will inspire your next meal. Now, some weeks it's just me chatting with you about my favorite tips and tricks, quick meal ideas, or fun cooking stories. Other times, I'll invite special guests to share their insights and passion for food. So, whether you're a seasoned cook or just learning your way around the stove, there's something for everyone. Now, let's get cooking. Today, we're diving into the flavorful world of seasoning. Have you ever wondered why someone else's food tastes so much better than your own? You could be making the exact same recipe, but the end result can be very different. Now, when this happens, it usually boils down to seasoning. Some cooks understand that you need to season your food as you cook to really enhance the flavors. And if you don't season your food, you're going to end up with bland, less flavorful food. And by seasoning, I'm not just talking about salt and pepper. We're going to dig into some other seasonings here. And when food is seasoned properly as it's prepared, it tends to taste better. Whereas if you just sprinkle salt onto already cooked food, oftentimes it makes it taste, just outright salty. So let's dig into the basics. Why do we season food? If you've watched any of the cooking shows, they are always seasoning their food as they go along. Do you remember back in the day? Can you remember when I first got married? The big cooking show was with Emeril Lagasse, and his big thing was like, bam. And he would, throw the salt and be like, bam. Like that was his big buzzword. That's all about seasoning food, right? He's making that big bam, that big impression on his food by just adding some salt. So, simply put, seasoning is enhancing the natural flavors of ingredients. It's not about changing the taste, but rather bringing out the best in what you're cooking. Salt and pepper are really the dynamic duo of seasoning, working together to amplify flavors that are already there in whatever it is that you're making. But seasoning isn't just about taste. It also plays a crucial role in the cooking process itself, right? Because cooking and baking, it's all about science. There's all those sciencey things going on. There's proteins and there's reactions and there's things that happen when our food is cooking. It's not just making it safe to consume it, but there's things that go on. So, for example, when you add salt to vegetables like an onion, it will draw out the moisture from that vegetable. And that's going to help speed up the softening process and ensure a more even cooking. It may also help in browning of things. And this is why seasoning as you cook is so important, because it's not just about that final flavor, but about how these ingredients are interacting and developing throughout the cooking process. Now, you might be wondering, well, why don't we just season our stuff at the end? Or I put salt on the end when I cook. What's the difference there? And there's a big difference between seasoning as you cook and simply salting your food once it's on your plate. Huge, huge difference. When you season throughout the cooking process, you're building layers of flavor. Each ingredient really gets a chance to absorb the seasonings that you're adding, and it results in a more complex and harmonious dish. It's like, if we used a music analogy, if you create a symphony, you have each instrument, or in this case, the instrument would be ingredients, they're all playing their part to create a beautiful whole. And that's what happens when we cook and when we season. And I know that was like a little fluffy, but you get my point. On the other hand, salting at the end only affects the surface of your food. And while it can still enhance flavor, it doesn't have the same depth or complexity as seasoning throughout the cooking process. Now, you might end up by oversalting your food because you're trying to compensate for the lack of seasoning within the dish. So, if you're concerned about your salt intake, because we talked a lot about salt here, I want you to start small. So incorporate small amounts as you're cooking rather than adding it at the end, and just see how that affects the flavor of your food. So, building layers of flavor is a key technique in cooking, and it's something I've been talking about, as we've been going through here. So start with the base of salt and pepper, right? Those are the two key ones that you see in most recipes. And these two ingredients are really the foundation for most dishes. And as you cook and you get more comfortable, you can add other seasonings like garlic, onion, and herbs to really start building complexity in your recipes. My all purpose seasoning blend recipe is one of the most popular recipes on It Is a Keeper. It's a homemade blend that you can make. It's super easy and it adds great flavor to any savory recipe. I use this in lieu of salt and pepper in just about every single thing I make. If I'm scrambling eggs, I use my all purpose seasoning. If I'm making a roast, I'm using that instead of salt and pepper. And when I make this blend, I usually make a big batch and store it in an airtight container like a mason jar or another container with a tight fitting lid. And I also keep a smaller container right near my cooktop so it's handy whenever I need it. So anytime a recipe calls for salt and pepper, I'm using that blend. You can find a link to this recipe in the show notes or at itisakeeper.com/BTR. Just go to the link for this episode and you'll find it right there. But remember, when you're seasoning, a little can go a long way, and it's always easier to add more than to take it away if you put in too much. So, how do we start building layers of flavor? Well, it's really all about timing and technique. And here's a general guide you can follow. First, start with your aromatics, right? Those are like sauteing those aromatic vegetables like onions and garlic or celery, because this is going to create a flavor base for your dish. And you'll notice as you're reading many savory recipes, if they have onion, in them, it will usually start by sauteing the onions first. And that's really laying the foundation for that flavor. Now, be careful with garlic because if you're using garlic in a recipe, it doesn't need to cook very long. And what I mean by that is like 30 seconds. As soon as you can smell that, it's done. So don't overcook the garlic. Doing so will burn it and then it gets really bitter and that will immediately ruin your recipe. So usually add the garlic, cook it for 30 seconds and then move on. Okay, number two, add your spices early. Dried spices and herbs should be added early in the cooking process because this allows their flavor to develop and infuse into the dish. They need time to bloom and to release their oils and really lend their flavors to whatever it is you're cooking. Third, season in stages. As you add new ingredients, season each layer. We're not talking about adding a lot of salt and pepper or seasoning to each layer, but just a little bit. And this will ensure that every component of your dish is well flavored. Number four, taste and adjust. Throughout the cooking process, taste your dish as you go and adjust the seasoning as you need. You'll you'll know like if it needs seasoning just by tasting it, right? We can always tell is there enough flavor? Is it not enough flavor? Does it taste flat? Does it taste bland? And remember, it's easier to add more than to take it away. And last, finish with any fresh herbs. So if you're using fresh herbs, add them towards the end of the cooking process because that's going to preserve their bright flavors. So let's talk a little bit about spices and herbs and how to use them effectively. So, dried spices and herbs should be used and added early in the cooking process, like I just mentioned, because they need time to heat up and to release their flavors fully. For long cooking dishes like soups and stews, you want to add them during the last 45 to 60 minutes of cooking because this is going to prevent those flavors from cooking off. So, the same thing if you're using a slow cooker. If you have something in there for 4 or 8 hours, the flavorings are going to cook off. So you want to add those flavorings the last hour or so of cooking to really capitalize on those flavor profiles. Now, fresh herbs, on the other hand, are best added at the end of cooking because their delicate flavors can get lost with prolonged heat. So, for dishes like salads or cold pasta, obviously you're just going to add those fresh herbs before you serve them, and that's going to give you the brightest flavor. And the same is true for cooked dishes. So, sauces or soups or anything like that, if you're adding those fresh, bright green herbs, do it at the end right before you serve. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between fresh and dried. So fresh herbs have that bright, vibrant color that really it's like irreplaceable in some dishes, right? If you were to make guacamole and you use fresh cilantro, it's going to be very different than if you use dried cilantro. You're not going to get the same flavor out of, even though they're both cilantro, you're just not going to get the same flavor. So fresh herbs are perfect in raw applications or adding a final touch to cooked dishes. So when people sprinkle like fresh chopped parsley, it's not just for pretty color. I mean, it does add nice color to your final dish, but a lot of times it just adds that little bit of brightness that you're looking for and that your palate needs when you're eating. Now, dried herbs, however, they really have their place too. They work well in long cooking dishes where the fresh herbs are going to lose their flavor. Now, as a general rule, you can make some substitutions here. So, like fresh rosemary versus dried rosemary. As a general rule, use 1/3 the amount of dried herbs as you would fresh. So, for example, if a recipe calls for 3 teaspoons of fresh rosemary, you would use 1 teaspoon of dried in its place. So, some of them you can use um, interchangeably. Now, remember, dried herbs will lose their potency over time. So, if your herbs have been sitting in your cupboard for more than a year, it's time to get rid of them. So I think it's always a good practice to write the date that you purchased your herbs right on the jar or the container so you can easily see it, and then make a habit to clean out your seasoning stash on a regular basis. It really will make a difference. They do lose a lot of flavor as they sit there. Now, seasoning is truly an art form, and it really takes patience and practice to master how to blend seasonings and make things, that are very harmonious, but the results are so well worth it. And by seasoning throughout the cooking process, you'll create dishes with depth and complexity and balance, and this is what's going to make your food taste good. So remember, cooking is all about experimentation and finding what works for you. Don't be afraid to play with different seasonings and techniques. Once you learn a recipe and you've made it according to the recipe the first time and you know how it works, then get in there the next time you make it and play around with different seasonings, different spices, different herbs, and see what you like. So thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Behind the Recipe. I hope you enjoyed our conversation and picked up a few tips or recipes to try in your own kitchen. If you love this episode, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast player and leave a review and share it with your friends. And I'd love to hear from you. Send me your questions, feedback, or recipe ideas. Just head over to itisakeeper.com/BTR for Behind the Recipe. And until next time, happy cooking. And remember, everything's better when shared in the kitchen.